Chapter 3. The First Encounter. Emily woke up the next morning with a sense of unease, as if something was about to happen. The conversation with Sheriff Richards still echoed in her mind, but what disturbed her the most was the return of Robert Taylor. She hadn't seen Robert in years, and the idea of meeting him again, even under such grim circumstances, brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. Robert and Emily had grown up together in Silent Creek. He was a few years older and had always been like a protective brother to her. When he decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, Emily felt like she was losing a piece of her security. Now, with his return, she didn't know whether to feel relieved to have someone trustworthy nearby or worried about what fate had in store for both of them. Early that afternoon, as Emily prepared to meet Robert, her phone rang. It was Sarah, her friend, who was still deeply shaken by the encounter with the Spectral Bride. "Emily, you won't believe what I found out," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. "What is it?" Emily asked, immediately apprehensive. "I spoke with an older woman in town, Mrs. Harper. She told me that the story of the Spectral Bride is older than we thought. They say she was a woman named Evelyn, who married a man named Henry in the late 1800s. On their wedding night, Henry took her to that abandoned restroom and killed her to be with another woman." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The story was starting to make sense, but the cruelty of the act was disturbing. "Are you sure about this, Sarah? I mean, stories like this always have some exaggeration." "I know, Emily, but Mrs. Harper seemed convinced. She said Evelyn swore revenge with her last breath, and that her spirit remained trapped in that restroom, waiting for the right moment to take revenge on all the women she believed were Henry's lover." Silence filled the phone line as Emily processed the information. Suddenly, a knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Sarah, I'll have to call you back later. Robert is here." "All right, but Emily, be careful. Something tells me this story is real, and the Spectral Bride won't stop until she gets what she wants." Emily hung up the phone and took a deep breath before opening the door. On the other side stood Robert with the same confident posture as always, but with a more serious expression than she remembered. His blue eyes, which used to be warm, now seemed to scrutinize every detail around him. "Emily," he said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "it's good to see you, despite the circumstances." "It's good to see you too, Robert. Come in," Emily replied, trying to shake off the discomfort. They sat in the living room, and for a moment, only silence surrounded them. "I heard what happened to you and Sarah," Robert began finally. "I'm here to help in any way I can, but I need you to tell me exactly what you saw that night." Emily recounted everything, from the moment she and Sarah decided to explore the restroom to the instant they came face to face with the Spectral Bride. As she spoke, she could see that Robert was paying attention to every detail, absorbing the information like an experienced detective. "And you believe this apparition is connected to the disappearances?" he asked after she finished. "I don't just believe, Robert. I know it is," Emily replied without hesitation. "That woman, whatever she is the cause of all this, and if we don't do something, more people will die." Robert remained silent for a moment, thinking about how to proceed. "I've heard of vengeful spirits in my work, but I've never faced something like this directly. If what you're saying is true, we need to find out more about her. We need to understand what keeps her here and how we can stop her." Emily agreed, feeling a small spark of hope ignite within her. "Mrs. Harper, a woman Sarah met, said the Spectral Bride was a woman named Evelyn, killed by her husband on their wedding night. Maybe she knows more about the story." "Great. Let's start there," Robert said, standing up. "Let's go to Mrs. Harper's house now. The sooner we get more information, the better." They took Robert's car and drove to Mrs. Harper's house, an old building somewhat isolated at the end of a narrow street. The elderly woman welcomed them with cautious cordiality, but her eyes revealed a lifetime of knowledge and experiences. "So, you want to know about Evelyn," Mrs. Harper said as she invited them to sit in her cozy living room. "Evelyn wasn't a bad woman, you know. She was just unhappy. When she discovered Henry's betrayal, something inside her broke. They say it was the hatred that kept her here, trapped in this world." Robert and Emily listened intently as Mrs. Harper narrated the story. Evelyn was the daughter of a wealthy family, but her life had been marked by tragedies from an early age. When Henry came into her life, it seemed like things were finally falling into place. He was charming, well-mannered, and seemed genuinely in love with her. But shortly after the wedding, Evelyn discovered that Henry had betrayed her with another woman, and it devastated her. On the night of the wedding, Henry took her to the abandoned restroom under the pretext of showing her something special. There, he brutally murdered her, and it is said that he threw her body into a well near the site. Since then, her spirit never found rest, and she began to haunt any woman she believed was trying to take what was hers. "But why the restroom?" Emily asked, perplexed. "Why does she haunt that place?" "I think it's because that's where she lost everything," Mrs. Harper replied with a heavy sigh. "Love, life, hope. Everything ended in that restroom, and now she's trapped there, reliving the same pain, night after night." The weight of the story settled over Emily and Robert, but the most important question remained unanswered. How could they stop Evelyn and end the curse that plagued Silent Creek? "Is there anything we can do to free her?" Robert asked, the seriousness in his voice reflecting the urgency of the situation. Mrs. Harper looked at them with a somber expression. "I've heard of a ritual, something ancient that might help a spirit find peace, but it's dangerous, and if something goes wrong..." "We're willing to try," Emily interrupted, determined. "We can't let more people suffer because of this. We need to try." Mrs. Harper slowly nodded, as if weighing their chances of success. "You'll need something personal of Evelyn's, something that belonged to her. You'll need to go back to the restroom and face whatever is there. And most importantly, you'll need to convince Evelyn to leave this world." "Convince a vengeful spirit?" Robert murmured, incredulous. "That sounds impossible." "Maybe it is," Mrs. Harper replied grimly, "but it's the only chance you have." Emily and Robert left Mrs. Harper's house with more questions than answers. Night was falling, and the fog was beginning to form again over Silent Creek. Time was running out, and they knew they needed to act quickly. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, trying to stay calm. "We find where Evelyn's body is," Robert said with renewed determination. "And then we figure out how to free her." As they walked toward the car, Emily felt that same sensation of being watched. She looked over her shoulder but saw nothing except the thick fog enveloping the town. But deep down, she knew the Spectral Bride was close, waiting for them. Chapter 4. The Investigation. The night in Silent Creek was colder than usual. The streets were deserted, and the fog moved like a living presence, covering every corner of the town. Emily and Robert drove in silence, the tension between them palpable. The car slid along the nearly empty road, its lights cutting through the dense fog as they headed toward the place where they believed Evelyn's body was hidden. Their final destination was the abandoned restroom, which now seemed even more sinister at night. But first, they needed to discover the exact location of Evelyn's body. Robert knew there were old documents at the town hall that might offer some clues, and he decided that would be their first step. Arriving at the town hall, an old building with stone columns and tall windows, they were greeted by the janitor, an elderly man who had known Robert since childhood. "Do you know where the old archives are, Mr. Hargrove?" Robert asked. The man nodded with a tired smile. "In the basement. I can't remember the last time someone asked to see those dusty documents. But if you need them, they're all there. Just watch out for the spiders." Robert thanked him and led Emily down to the basement. The place was damp, and the smell of mold was penetrating. But among the piles of boxes and files, there was something of value: old maps of Silent Creek, property records, and residents' accounts dating back more than a century. They began sifting through the documents, searching for any mention of the abandoned restroom or Henry and Evelyn. The hours passed slowly, and Emily's patience was beginning to wear thin when Robert finally found something. "Look at this," he said, showing Emily an old map. "This is the land where the restroom is located. But see here, there's a well marked near the building. It's not mentioned in any of the more recent records." Emily looked at the map, her eyes following the line that indicated the well. "So, that's where Evelyn was thrown after she was murdered. It makes sense that her spirit is trapped in that place, close to where her body was left. Robert nodded. We need to investigate this well. If we can find any trace of Evelyn's body, we might be able to perform the ritual and free her spirit. With the map in hand, they left the town hall and headed for the abandoned restroom. The silence of the town was almost oppressive, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. When they arrived at the restroom, the place was even more terrifying than before. Shadows moved in the fog, and the sound of the wind in the trees sounded like whispers from restless spirits. Robert held a flashlight, and Emily tried to control the fear growing in her chest. "Let's go," Robert said, his voice firm. "We need to find this well." They began exploring the area around the restroom, moving cautiously through the overgrown weeds and debris. Finally, in the light of the flashlight, the outline of old stones appeared, forming an irregular circle on the ground. It was the well. Robert knelt beside the well, shining the flashlight inside. "It's very dark. I can't see the bottom, but it looks like the structure is still intact." Emily approached, looking into the darkness that seemed endless. "What do we do now? We can't just climb down there." "No, but we can try to take some samples," Robert said, grabbing a rope and a bucket they had found at the town hall. He tied the rope to the bucket and slowly lowered it into the well. Time seemed to drag as they waited for the bucket to reach the bottom. When they finally pulled it back up, it was filled with dark water and mud. But among the muck, something else appeared. A piece of fabric, old and tattered, but unmistakably part of a wedding dress. Emily felt her stomach turn at the sight of the fabric. "That's it," she said, her voice trembling. "Evelyn's dress. She's down there." Robert nodded, his expression grim. "We need to take it to Mrs. Harper. She'll tell us how to proceed with the ritual." They carefully stored the fabric and left the site, Emily's heart heavy with what they had discovered. The terror of knowing Evelyn's body was so close and that she might be watching them at every moment was almost unbearable. When they arrived at Mrs. Harper's house, it was already past midnight. The woman received them with a serious but not surprised expression. It seemed she already knew what they would bring. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked, looking at the piece of dress Emily was holding. "Yes," Emily replied, handing it to her. "What do we do now?" Mrs. Harper took the dress carefully, as if holding something sacred. "The ritual must be done where the spirit is strongest. We need to go back to the restroom, to the well. There, we'll use the dress to try to free Evelyn." "And if it goes wrong?" Robert asked, always practical. "Then she will become even more dangerous," Mrs. Harper replied without sugarcoating it. "But if it works, she will finally find peace." Emily didn't know what to expect from the ritual, but she knew there was no turning back. They would return to the abandoned restroom, the place where it all began, to face Evelyn's vengeful spirit one last time. And if they failed, they knew there would be no escape. "Let's go now," said Mrs. Harper, "before it's too late." The tension in the air was palpable as they returned to the restroom, with Mrs. Harper leading the way. When they arrived, the place seemed to have been taken over by an even deeper darkness, as if the very air was heavy with Evelyn's presence. Mrs. Harper began preparing the ritual, drawing symbols on the ground with salt and placing candles around the well. She lit each candle, whispering ancient words that Emily couldn't understand, but which sent a chill down her spine. "Emily, hold the dress over the well," Mrs. Harper instructed. "Robert, keep the flashlight steady. Everything must be done exactly as the ritual requires." Emily did as instructed, her hands trembling as she held the piece of dress over the dark well. She felt Evelyn's presence stronger than ever, as if she were right beside them, watching every move. Mrs. Harper began chanting a series of incantations, the words flowing from her mouth with an intensity that seemed to make the ground tremble. The darkness around them seemed to grow, and Emily felt an invisible pressure on her body, almost as if something were trying to push her into the well. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp scream, a female voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the well. Emily felt her legs weaken, and the flashlight in Robert's hand began to flicker. "Hold firm," Mrs. Harper shouted, her voice strong despite the intensity of the moment. "She's resisting. Don't let her win." The scream continued, a mix of pain and anger that pierced everyone's ears. Emily gritted her teeth, keeping the dress in place with all her strength, feeling that she was about to be dragged into the abyss along with it. Then, as if an invisible force had been cut, the scream ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, and the flashlight stopped flickering, illuminating the well steadily once again. "It's done," Mrs. Harper said with a deep sigh. "Evelyn's spirit has been freed. She won't haunt this place anymore." Emily felt a wave of relief, her legs finally giving way as she knelt beside the well. Robert helped her to her feet, both exhausted but relieved to have survived the encounter. "Thank you," Emily murmured, her voice broken by exhaustion and emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." "You were brave, Emily," Robert said with a tired smile. "Now, maybe the town can finally have peace." As they left the abandoned restroom, the fog seemed to begin dissipating, and the air was lighter than before. Silent Creek still had its secrets, but at least one of the oldest and darkest had finally been resolved. But deep down, Emily knew that peace was only temporary. The town still had its shadows, and who knows what other horrors were hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. If you haven't watched chapters 1 and 2 yet, click on the video appearing on the screen to catch up from the beginning. And stay tuned, chapters 5 and 6 will be available soon. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. See you next time.